Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, there exists a space where stories become something more than mere words. Here, in this liminal realm between waking and sleeping, the greatest tales of antiquity whisper their secrets to those willing to listen. Among all the love stories that have echoed through the corridors of time, few possess the devastating power, the heartbreaking beauty, and the world-shattering consequences of the romance between Paris and Helen. This is not simply a tale of two lovers who defied convention. This is the story of how a single choice made by a shepherd prince and the most beautiful woman in the world ignited a war that would rage for 10 years, topple the mighty walls of Troy, and transform the ancient world forever. It is a story woven from threads of divine intervention and mortal passion, of prophecies that could not be escaped and desires that could not be denied. It is a story that asks us to consider the true cost of love, the weight of destiny, and whether any romance, no matter how intense, can justify the rivers of blood that flowed in its wake. But to understand how Paris and Helen came to stand at the center of mythology's greatest war, we must first travel back to the very beginning, to two extraordinary births that would shape the fate of gods and mortals alike. Helen's origin story reads like something from a fevered dream. According to most accounts, her father was none other than Zeus himself, the king of the Olympian gods, whose appetites for mortal women were as legendary as his thunderbolts. Her mother, in the most widely told version, was Leda, the beautiful queen of Sparta. Zeus, in his infinite creativity when it came to seduction, approached Leda in the form of a swan. The encounter that followed would become the subject of countless artistic representations throughout the centuries, though the ancient sources remained somewhat delicate about the specific details. What emerged from this divine union was not a normal birth, but something far stranger. Leda laid eggs, from which Helen and her siblings hatched. Some traditions claim that Helen alone emerged from the egg sired by Zeus, while her twin sister Clytemnestra and brothers Castor and Pollux had different origins. Other versions suggest all 4 siblings shared this unusual entrance into the world. Regardless of the specific details, the important fact remained clear. Helen carried within her the blood of the gods themselves. This divine heritage manifested itself in her appearance in ways that transcended normal human beauty. Writers throughout antiquity struggled to adequately capture Helen's appearance with words. Homer, the great epic poet, repeatedly described her as white-armed Helen, Helen of the lovely hair, and Helen, queen among women. These phrases, repeated like a sacred refrain throughout his works, suggest beauty so profound it bordered on the supernatural. Her loveliness was not merely physical perfection, but something that seemed to emanate from her very being, a radiance that drew the eye and captured the heart before conscious thought could intervene. Even those who despised her for the destruction she would eventually cause could not deny the power of her appearance. Homer himself, in moments of brutal honesty, also called her fateful Helen, acknowledging the complicated legacy that would forever surround her name. Helen's early years in Sparta were anything but ordinary. Even as a young girl, her extraordinary beauty attracted dangerous attention. When she was still a child, the famous hero Theseus, king of Athens and slayer of the Minotaur, abducted her. Theseus, despite his advancing years and heroic reputation, became obsessed with the idea of marrying a daughter of Zeus. Together with his companion Pirithous, he kidnapped the young Helen and entrusted her to the care of his mother, Aethra, planning to marry her once she reached womanhood. This violation would not stand. Helen's brothers, the twins Castor and Pollux, known collectively as the Dioscuri, raised an army and invaded Athens itself. They rescued their sister and brought her home to Sparta, taking Aethra as a prisoner in the process. The incident served as an ominous preview of the conflicts that would follow Helen throughout her life. As Helen matured into young womanhood, her beauty only intensified, and soon her father, Tyndareus, faced an unprecedented problem. Suitors arrived from every corner of the Greek world, each hoping to win the hand of the most beautiful woman alive. The list of her admirers read like a catalogue of the age's greatest heroes. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca; Ajax, the tower of strength; Diomedes, the fierce warrior; and dozens of other princes, kings, and heroes, each bringing gifts and making promises in hopes of securing her as their bride. Tyndareus recognized the danger inherent in this situation. When he chose one suitor, all the others would feel slighted, potentially leading to violence and political chaos throughout Greece. It was Odysseus, showcasing the cleverness that would make him famous, who proposed the solution that would have such profound consequences for the future. He suggested that all the suitors should swear a sacred oath, promising to respect Helen's marriage choice and to defend her chosen husband against any who might try to harm him or steal her away. In exchange for this brilliant solution, Tyndareus agreed to support Odysseus in his own romantic pursuit of Penelope. The suitors agreed to this oath, known thereafter as the Oath of Tyndareus, each man placing his hand upon the sacrificial remains of a horse as he swore to uphold the sanctity of Helen's marriage. They could not have known, in that moment, how heavily this promise would weigh upon them. They could not have foreseen that this oath would drag them across the sea to fight in a war that would consume 10 years of their lives and claim the majority of their comrades. The oath seemed, at the time, like a reasonable price to pay for a chance at winning the hand of the most beautiful woman in the world. In the end, Tyndareus chose Menelaus, younger brother of the powerful King Agamemnon of Mycenae. Menelaus was not the strongest or the cleverest of Helen's suitors, but he was perhaps the wealthiest, and his connection to Agamemnon made him a valuable political ally. He became king of Sparta through this marriage, as Tyndareus and his wife Leda stepped down from the throne. Helen and Menelaus would have at least one daughter together, Hermione, and according to some accounts, 3 sons as well, Aetheolus, Maraphius, and Pleisthenes. For perhaps 10 years, they ruled Sparta together, and by most accounts, they lived in harmony, at least initially, while Helen grew into her role as Queen of Sparta, far to the east. Another story was unfolding on the slopes of Mount Ida, outside the great city of Troy. Here, the second half of our tale's central couple was coming into being under circumstances every bit as strange as Helen's own birth. Paris was born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, but his arrival was preceded by a terrible omen. Shortly before his birth, Hecuba experienced a vivid and terrifying dream. She saw herself giving birth not to a child, but to a flaming torch that spread fire throughout the city, consuming Troy in flames. When she awoke in terror and shared this vision with her husband, they consulted the seer Aesacus, who interpreted the dream with chilling clarity. The child about to be born would bring about the complete destruction of Troy. Faced with this prophecy, Priam and Hecuba made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They ordered their chief herdsman, a man named Agelaus, to take the newborn child to Mount Ida and leave him there to die from exposure. It was a common enough practice in the ancient world when prophecies threatened disaster, though no less heartbreaking for its familiarity. Agelaus carried out his orders, leaving the infant Paris alone on the mountainside, presumably to perish from the elements or become prey for wild animals. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Paris. Some versions of the story claim that a she-bear found the abandoned infant and nursed him with her own cubs. Other accounts suggest that Agelaus, unable to fully carry out such a cruel command, returned to check on the child after 9 days and was astonished to find him still alive. Moved by the infant's survival against such odds, the herdsman brought the boy home and raised him as his own son, returning to Priam with a dog's tongue as false proof that the deed had been completed. Paris grew up as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, unaware of his royal heritage. Despite his humble circumstances, his noble birth manifested itself in ways that could not be entirely hidden. He possessed extraordinary beauty, unusual intelligence, and natural courage that set him apart from the other shepherds. As a young man, he earned the alternate name Alexander, meaning defender of men, after he successfully drove off a band of cattle thieves and returned the stolen animals to their rightful owners. This combination of physical beauty and evident nobility would prove to be both his greatest asset and his most dangerous quality. It was during these years as a shepherd that Paris experienced his first great love, a romance that would be forgotten by history in light of later events, but which deserves its place in this tale of love and tragedy. Her name was Oenone, and she was a naiad nymph, daughter of the river god Sebren. She made her home near a spring on Mount Ida, and it was there that she and Paris encountered each other. Oenone possessed gifts that went beyond the typical beauty associated with nymphs. She had been taught the art of healing by Apollo himself, gaining deep knowledge of medicinal herbs and their properties that was unmatched in the region. Additionally, she had received the gift of prophecy directly from Rhea, the Titaness and mother of Zeus. These supernatural abilities, combined with her immortal nature and stunning appearance, made her a remarkable figure in her own right, not merely an accessory to Paris's story. When Oenone first saw Paris tending his flocks on the mountainside, she fell deeply in love with the young shepherd, whose beauty and bearing suggested something more than his humble station. Paris, for his part, was completely entranced by the nymph. What mortal man could resist the attention of an immortal being who chose to love him? They began a relationship that was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Paris swore his eternal devotion to Oenone, promising that he would never leave her, that their love would endure forever. The couple married in the fashion of that time and place, and Oenone bore Paris a son, whom they named Corythus. They built a life together on the slopes of Mount Ida, a simple existence focused on the herds, the changing seasons, and their growing family. To an outside observer, there might have seemed nothing remarkable about a shepherd and his wife living out their days in the mountains. But Oenone, with her gift of prophecy, could see threads of fate weaving themselves into patterns that terrified her. She tried to warn Paris of what was coming. She told him that his love for her, while genuine now, would not last forever. She prophesied that he would one day sail across the sea to pursue another woman, bringing ruin to his family and death to countless thousands. She predicted that he would be wounded in the war that followed, and that only she would possess the knowledge and power to heal him. Paris, perhaps disturbed by these dark visions, perhaps simply unwilling to believe that his love could ever change, always attempted to dismiss her warnings. He tried to stop her whenever she began speaking of these future tragedies, preferring to focus on their present happiness rather than dwelling on a fate he could not imagine wanting. But prophecies in Greek mythology are not suggestions or possibilities. They are inevitabilities, cosmic truths that will manifest regardless of mortal wishes or efforts to avoid them. The machinery of fate was already grinding forward, preparing to sweep Paris and Oenone apart and drag Helen into an orbit that would destroy everything in its path. The mechanism that would shatter Paris and Oenone's peaceful life, and ultimately bring him together with Helen, was set in motion at what should have been the most joyous of occasions, a wedding celebration on Mount Olympus. The bride and groom were Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a beautiful sea nymph who was herself a minor goddess. This was to be the grandest celebration the divine realm had seen in ages, and Zeus, as king of the gods, ordered that every deity be invited to attend. The festivities would be magnificent, with nectar and ambrosia flowing freely, divine music filling the air, and the assembled immortals celebrating the union of sea and earth. Every god and goddess received an invitation, with one notable exception. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, was deliberately left off the guest list. The reasoning seemed sound at the time. Who would want to invite the personification of chaos and conflict to a wedding? What good could possibly come from having the goddess whose very nature was to sow dissension among the gathered celebrants? Better, the planners decided, to exclude her and enjoy an evening of unmarred happiness. This decision would prove to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in mythological history. Eris, discovering that she alone among the divine beings had been snubbed, felt her rage ignite into something cold and calculating. She would have her revenge, and it would be far more devastating than any simple act of violence or destruction. She crafted a golden apple, beautiful beyond description, and upon its gleaming surface she inscribed a single phrase in Greek: "To Callista," to the fairest, or for the most beautiful. On the night of the celebration, as the gods and goddesses feasted and danced in the great halls of Olympus, Eris appeared at the gates. Before anyone could prevent her, she hurled the golden apple into the midst of the assembled deities and vanished. The apple rolled across the floor, its inscription catching the light and drawing every eye. Immediately, 3 goddesses reached for it, each convinced that it must be meant for her. Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, claimed the apple as rightfully hers. As the most powerful goddess and consort of the king of Olympus, who else could possibly be considered more beautiful? Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, insisted that the apple must be intended for her. Her perfection was not merely physical, but intellectual and martial as well. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty itself, laughed at the presumption of the other 2. If anyone deserved to be called the most beautiful, it was she who literally embodied beauty as a divine concept. The celebration immediately descended into chaos. The 3 goddesses argued with increasing intensity, each marshalling examples of her own superiority and belittling the claims of her rivals. The other gods and goddesses, wisely, stayed out of the dispute. The tension grew so severe that it threatened to escalate into divine conflict. Eventually, the 3 goddesses agreed on one point. They needed an impartial judge to settle the matter definitively. They brought their dispute to Zeus, expecting him to render judgment. But Zeus, showing the political savvy that had helped him maintain his throne, absolutely refused to make this choice. He understood perfectly well that choosing any one of these 3 would earn him the eternal enmity of the other 2. Hera was his wife. Athena was his daughter and one of his favorites. Aphrodite wielded power over love and desire that could make even the king of gods uncomfortable. There was no possible choice that would not result in lasting consequences for him. Instead, Zeus proposed an alternative. He would appoint a mortal to make the decision, someone who had proven himself to be fair and just, incapable of being swayed by improper considerations. He had recently heard of a young shepherd on Mount Ida who had demonstrated remarkable fairness when he judged a contest between a magnificent bull he had raised himself and a bull that later proved to be the god Ares in disguise. Despite his attachment to his own animal, Paris had unhesitatingly awarded the prize to Ares, showing himself to be immune to bias and self-interest. This Paris, Zeus declared, would judge which of the three goddesses deserved the golden apple. Hermes, the messenger god, was dispatched to Mount Ida to collect Paris and bring him before the three goddesses. Paris, still ignorant of his true identity as a prince of Troy, was terrified when Hermes appeared and informed him of the task ahead. What mortal could possibly feel comfortable judging the beauty of goddesses? But Hermes assured him that this was the will of Zeus himself, and refusal was not an option. The three goddesses appeared before Paris on the slopes of Mount Ida. Various artistic traditions and poetic accounts differ on exactly how they presented themselves, but many sources suggest they disrobed entirely, allowing Paris to appreciate their physical forms without obstruction. But Paris, despite being presented with three goddesses in all their divine glory, found himself unable to make a decision. All three were breathtakingly beautiful, each in her own unique way. How could any mortal possibly choose between them? The goddesses, recognizing his dilemma, decided to help him make up his mind by offering bribes. Each goddess promised Paris a gift that reflected her own domain and power. Incentives meant to tip the scales in her favor. Hera spoke first, offering Paris political power beyond imagination. If he chose her, she would make him ruler of all of Europe and Asia. He would command the greatest empire the world had ever seen, with countless nations bowing before his throne. Wealth, power, and dominion over vast territories would be his for the taking. For a shepherd who had known nothing but simple mountain life, this was a staggering offer. Athena presented her own enticement. She promised Paris wisdom, surpassing that of all other mortals, combined with skill in battle that would make him invincible. She would grant him the abilities of the greatest warriors, ensuring that he would never be defeated in combat. Strategic genius and martial prowess would elevate him above all other heroes of his age. He would become not just powerful, but genuinely great, a warrior and thinker whose name would echo through the ages for his achievements rather than merely his conquests. Then Aphrodite made her offer, and in doing so, changed the course of history. She promised Paris something that appealed to a different aspect of human desire. She would give him the love of the most beautiful, mortal woman in the world. Not power, not glory, not wisdom or strength, but love. Specifically, she offered him Helen of Sparta, whose beauty was famous throughout Greece, whose loveliness was said to rival that of the goddesses themselves. Paris, perhaps moved by Aphrodite's own irresistible beauty, perhaps thinking of the emptiness of power without love, perhaps simply following the path that fate had already laid out for him, made his choice. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, declaring her the fairest of the three goddesses. In that moment, Paris sealed not only his own fate, but that of Troy, Helen, and countless thousands who would die in the war to come. Hera and Athena, their pride deeply wounded, stormed away from Mount Ida. Their humiliation would fester into a hatred of Paris and, by extension, all of Troy. When war eventually came, these two powerful goddesses would throw their considerable might behind the Greek forces, working tirelessly to ensure Troy's complete destruction. The judgment of Paris, as this episode came to be known, had set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in one of mythology's greatest tragedies. But Paris, in that moment, cared nothing for future consequences. He had been promised Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and Aphrodite would ensure he received his prize. Soon after, Paris's true identity as a prince of Troy was revealed through various circumstances. He returned to the city of his birth, was welcomed back into the royal family, despite the old prophecy, and began his life as a Trojan prince. His past with Oenone, his promises of eternal love, his wife and son on Mount Ida, all of it faded in importance as he prepared to claim the reward Aphrodite had promised him. Oenone watched him go, her heart breaking, but her prophetic sight showing her exactly how this story would end. She had tried to warn him. She had told him of the destruction that awaited. But prophecies, as we have noted, are not warnings that can be heeded. They are descriptions of what will be, regardless of mortal wishes or warnings. Now came perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire story, the question that ancient authors debated and that remains unresolved even today. What exactly happened when Paris went to Sparta? Was Helen abducted against her will? An innocent victim of divine machinations? Or did she leave willingly, choosing passion and romance over duty and propriety? The ancient sources themselves cannot agree, presenting versions of events that range from outright kidnapping to willing elopement. Paris arrived in Sparta on what appeared to be a diplomatic mission from Troy. King Priam, Paris's father, had various political connections with the Greek kingdoms, and Paris's journey seemed perfectly legitimate on its surface. Menelaus, demonstrating the hospitality that was sacred in Greek culture, welcomed the Trojan prince into his home. He provided Paris with the finest accommodations, shared his table with him, and treated him with all the honor due to a foreign prince. It was in this context that Paris and Helen first saw each other, and the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Homer suggests, in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, that Helen followed Paris to Troy willingly, indicating that whatever transpired between them involved genuine feeling on her part. Apollodorus describes the pair leaving together with considerable Spartan treasure in their possession, again suggesting coordination rather than violent abduction. But other sources paint a different picture, describing Paris essentially raiding Menelaus's palace and stealing Helen away by force. The truth, if such a concept can exist in mythology, likely lies somewhere in the complex middle ground. Aphrodite, having promised Helen to Paris, certainly used her divine power to ensure the outcome she had guaranteed. Some ancient authors suggest that the goddess cast a spell of overwhelming attraction, making it impossible for Helen to resist Paris's advances. Gorgias, a Greek philosopher and rhetorician, argued in his Encomium of Helen that Helen could not be held responsible for her actions because love has the divine power of the gods. Essentially, Aphrodite's influence made genuine choice impossible. But Homer's portrayal of Helen throughout the Iliad suggests a woman with agency, capable of complex thoughts and moral reasoning, who made a choice she would later regret, but which was nonetheless her own. In this reading, perhaps Aphrodite did not so much override Helen's free will as create the circumstances where her attraction to Paris felt irresistible. The goddess might have amplified genuine feelings, made existing dissatisfactions with her marriage more acute, or simply ensured that Helen and Paris had opportunities to fall genuinely in love. What we can say with certainty is that Helen left Sparta with Paris. Menelaus had departed for Crete to attend the funeral of King Catreus, leaving his palace and his wife unguarded, or at least guarded only by household servants who proved unequal to preventing what happened next. Whether Helen went to Paris's ship of her own accord, or whether he carried her there by force, the result was the same. When Menelaus returned home, his wife was gone, sailed away to Troy in the company of a foreign prince. And not only had Paris taken Helen, but he had also helped himself to a considerable portion of Spartan treasure, loading his ships with gold, silver, and precious objects from Menelaus's palace. The journey from Sparta to Troy gave Helen time to contemplate what she had done. Some versions suggest that during the voyage, she began to realize the magnitude of her actions. She had abandoned her husband, left behind her daughter Hermione, turned her back on the people of Sparta, who had treated her as their queen. She had violated every social contract and expectation of her role. But by then, it was too late to turn back. The ships sailed on toward Troy, carrying Helen toward a future that would be far more complicated and painful than any romantic fantasy Paris might have painted for her. Their reception in Troy was mixed, revealing the complexity of the situation that was developing. King Priam, perhaps moved by Paris's obvious infatuation, perhaps hoping to avoid conflict with his son, treated Helen with kindness and respect. He seemed to accept her presence in his city, though he must have understood the potential consequences. Other members of the royal family were far less welcoming. Hector, Paris's older brother and the greatest warrior of Troy, saw the situation with crystal clarity. He recognized that Paris had violated the sacred laws of hospitality by betraying Menelaus's trust. He understood that taking another man's wife, particularly the wife of a powerful Greek king, would inevitably lead to war. Hector urged Paris to send Helen back to Sparta immediately, to apologize for his transgression, and hope that the Greeks would accept his contrition rather than demanding blood. But Paris refused. He claimed that Aphrodite herself had brought them together, that their love was sanctioned by divine will. How could he turn away from a gift given by a goddess? Helen found herself in an impossibly difficult position. She was now living in a foreign city, surrounded by people who spoke her language but belonged to a different culture. Many of the Trojans viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing her as the cause of the conflict they knew was coming. She was isolated, caught between her old life and her new one, unable to return to Sparta, but not fully accepted in Troy. Later sources suggest that only a handful of people showed her genuine kindness during these years, and her loneliness was profound. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Menelaus's reaction to his wife's disappearance was exactly what Hector had predicted. His fury was absolute and immediate. This was not just a personal betrayal, but a violation of his honor as a king, a challenge to his authority and dignity that could not be ignored. He immediately turned to his older brother, King Agamemnon of Mycenae, who was both more powerful and more politically connected than Menelaus himself. Agamemnon, demonstrating both familial loyalty and political shrewdness, saw an opportunity beyond simply avenging his brother's wounded pride. He could use this violation to unite the Greek kingdoms in a common cause, assembling an army of unprecedented size and power. But first, he suggested a diplomatic solution. They would send ambassadors to Troy, requesting Helen's peaceful return. Agamemnon knew that Paris's father, King Priam, was fundamentally a reasonable man. Surely he would order his son to release Helen and avoid the catastrophe that war would bring. The embassy was dispatched to Troy with Menelaus's demand: return Helen and the stolen treasure, or face the combined might of Greece. The Trojans gathered to consider this ultimatum. Various voices argued for different courses of action. The more cautious counselors urged acceptance of the Greek demands. Helen was not worth a war. She could be returned with apologies and compensation, preserving Troy's honor while avoiding bloodshed. But Paris stood firm in his refusal. He claimed that Aphrodite herself had given Helen to him. To return her would be to reject a divine gift, to insult the goddess who had chosen him. And Helen, despite whatever private doubts she might have harbored, supported Paris's position. She did not wish to return to Menelaus. With this refusal, war became inevitable. Agamemnon invoked the oath of Tyndareus, calling upon all of Helen's former suitors to honor their pledge to defend her marriage. One by one, the great heroes of Greece answered the call. Odysseus, despite his reluctance and his attempts to avoid involvement through various stratagems, eventually agreed to join the expedition. Ajax, Diomedes, and countless other heroes gathered their forces. In total, according to the famous phrase, 1,000 ships assembled to sail against Troy. Helen's face had, indeed, launched 1,000 ships, though the reality behind that poetic image was far more complex than simple beauty, motivating men to war. The Greek forces gathered at Aulis, creating the largest military expedition Greece had ever assembled. The fleet that eventually sailed for Troy carried tens of thousands of warriors, enough men to besiege the mighty city that Priam's ancestors had built with the help of the gods themselves. The war that followed would consume 10 years, claim countless lives on both sides, and ultimately result in the complete destruction of Troy. But all of that was still in the future as the ships set sail, carrying Greece's heroes toward their various fates. Homer's Iliad, the greatest epic poem ever composed about the Trojan War, actually takes place during the 10th year of the conflict, covering only a few weeks of action, rather than the entire war. But throughout the poem, Helen is a constant presence, a figure who embodies the complex morality of the entire conflict. Homer portrays her as deeply conflicted, simultaneously regretful of the choice that brought her to Troy, and defensive of her actions when challenged. In Book 3 of the Iliad, there is a remarkable scene where Helen watches the armies preparing for battle from the walls of Troy. The old men of Troy sit nearby, and Homer tells us that when they see her, they cannot help but acknowledge her extraordinary beauty, even as they wish she had never come to their city. They say to each other that no one can blame the Trojans and Greeks for suffering so long for such a woman. Her beauty makes the war seem almost justified, even though they know intellectually that it is not. Helen herself is shown in this scene as full of self-loathing and regret. She calls herself a shameless whore and speaks longingly of her home in Sparta, her family, and the life she left behind. When Aphrodite appears to her, commanding her to go to Paris's bed, Helen actually resists the goddess, suggesting that Aphrodite herself should go lie with Paris if she loves him so much. This moment of rebellion earns her a sharp rebuke from the goddess, a reminder that mortals do not refuse divine commands, no matter how much they might wish to do so. Throughout the war, Helen lived with the knowledge that thousands were dying because of her. Every Trojan widow, every Greek mother who lost a son, every child left fatherless, all of it could be traced back, in some sense, to her decision to leave Sparta with Paris. This knowledge seems to have tormented her. Later in the Odyssey, when Helen and Menelaus are shown living together again after the war, she speaks of her time in Troy with obvious pain, claiming that she had wanted to return to Sparta for years, but had been unable to do so. Paris himself cuts a complicated figure in the Iliad. Homer portrays him as handsome and charming, but also vain and somewhat cowardly. He prefers to fight with a bow and arrows, keeping his distance from direct combat, rather than engaging in the close-quarters fighting that heroes were expected to prefer. His own brother Hector scolds him repeatedly throughout the poem for his reluctance to fight, for hiding away in his chambers with Helen, while other men die defending Troy. There is a famous scene early in the Iliad where Paris is supposed to fight Menelaus in single combat to settle the entire war. Paris initially agrees, but then becomes terrified when he actually faces Menelaus on the battlefield and tries to run away. Only Hector's shame-filled rebuke drives him back to face his opponent. The duel between Paris and Menelaus should have ended the war. The two men whose conflict had started everything would fight, and the winner would claim Helen, and the loser would accept defeat. They faced each other before the assembled armies of Greece and Troy, everyone watching this moment that should have brought resolution. Menelaus, the superior warrior by far, began to dominate the fight almost immediately. He was on the verge of killing Paris, of claiming his revenge and his wife, of ending 10 years of suffering in a single decisive moment. But then Aphrodite intervened, just as she had intervened so many times before in this story. The goddess, determined to protect the mortal she had promised so much to, surrounded Paris in a mist and whisked him away from the battlefield, depositing him safely in his chambers in Troy. She then compelled Helen to go to him, despite Helen's visible shame and reluctance. Menelaus was left standing on the battlefield, searching frantically for his opponent, denied his victory by divine interference. The war would continue. Paris's most significant contribution to the war came not through his own martial prowess, but through an act of archery that would change everything. Achilles, the greatest warrior on the Greek side, the man whose rage and battle prowess had been the subject of Homer's entire epic, seemed invincible in combat. He had cut through the Trojan ranks like wheat before a scythe, killing Hector himself in single combat and dragging the body around Troy's walls. The Greeks believed that with Achilles fighting for them, victory was inevitable, only a matter of time. But Achilles had a weakness, a vulnerability that was well known among the gods, if not among mortals. When his mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant to make him invulnerable, she had held him by his heel. That one spot where her fingers had gripped him had never touched the magical waters. It remained mortal, vulnerable to injury. And somehow, through divine guidance or remarkable fortune, Paris discovered this weakness. The circumstances of Achilles' death vary slightly between different ancient sources, but most agree on the essential details. Paris, guided by the god Apollo, who had his own reasons for hating Achilles, shot an arrow that struck the Greek hero in his vulnerable heel. Some versions suggest that Apollo actually directed the arrow's flight, ensuring it found its mark. Others claim that Paris made the shot himself, though even then, divine assistance likely played a role. Regardless of the specific mechanics, the result was the same. The arrow, possibly poisoned with the blood of the Hydra that Heracles had slain years before, delivered a mortal wound. Achilles, who had seemed invincible, who had killed so many Trojan warriors, including mighty Hector himself, fell dead on the battlefield of Troy. This killing of Achilles was simultaneously Paris's greatest triumph and ultimately the beginning of his own end. The Greeks, enraged by the loss of their champion, redoubled their efforts to breach Troy's walls. And among those Greeks was a warrior named Philoctetes, who carried weapons that would prove to be Paris's doom. Philoctetes possessed the bow and arrows of Heracles himself, weapons imbued with the poison of the Hydra. These were the same arrows that had killed so many of Heracles' enemies, each one capable of inflicting wounds that would not heal. Philoctetes had been abandoned on the island of Lemnos years earlier by his fellow Greeks because of a festering wound that emitted such a terrible odor that no one could stand to be near him. But the Greeks learned through prophecy that Troy could not be taken without Heracles' bow. They retrieved Philoctetes, treated his wound, and brought him to Troy specifically to use these legendary weapons against the Trojans. It was during a battle near the Scaean gates of Troy that Philoctetes drew his bow and aimed at Paris. The arrow flew true, striking the Trojan prince. According to some accounts, Philoctetes shot multiple arrows, ensuring that Paris received a mortal wound. Paris immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The wound burned with an unnatural fire, the Hydra's venom beginning its work immediately. He could feel the poison spreading through his body, and he knew with terrible certainty that this injury would kill him unless he received treatment that went beyond normal medical care. As Paris felt the poison coursing through his veins, his thoughts turned to the one person who might be able to save him. Oenone, his first wife, the woman he had abandoned to pursue Helen, possessed healing abilities that surpassed those of any mortal physician. She had been taught by Apollo himself or by the wise centaur Chiron, depending on which tradition one followed. If anyone could heal a wound inflicted by Heracles's poisoned arrows, it would be Oenone. Paris commanded his servants to carry him from Troy to Mount Ida, back to the mountains where he had once lived as a shepherd, where Oenone still made her home. The journey itself was agonizing. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. The poison was doing its work, and he could feel himself weakening with each passing hour. But he clung to hope. Oenone would save him. She had loved him once. Surely that love, or at least the memory of it, would compel her to use her healing arts to save his life. When Paris's servants finally brought him to Oenone's dwelling, he called out to her, begging her to help him. He acknowledged his betrayal, admitted that he had abandoned her for Helen, but pleaded that she not let him die for his mistakes. He invoked their shared past, their son, Corythus, the love they had once felt for each other. Surely she would not let him perish when she alone possessed the power to save him. But Oenone, standing before the man who had broken his vows to her, who had left her and their child without a backward glance to pursue another woman, who had brought war and destruction to the entire region through his selfish choices, refused. Her response, according to some accounts, was simple and devastating. Go to Helen. Let her heal you, if she can. Some versions of the story suggest that Oenone's refusal came from a place of wounded pride and righteous anger. Paris had made his choice years ago when he left her for Helen. He had chosen Helen's beauty over Oenone's love, had traded a genuine relationship for the promise Aphrodite had made him. Why should she save him now? Let him experience the consequences of his decisions. Let him understand what it meant to be abandoned by someone you had depended upon. Other traditions paint Oenone's refusal as more complex, suggesting that she was torn between her lingering feelings for Paris and her justified anger at his treatment of her. She had prophesied this very moment years earlier, had warned Paris that he would be wounded and would need her healing, had told him that she alone could save him. He had dismissed her warnings then. Perhaps she felt that allowing the prophecy to fulfill itself completely was the only way to validate the gift she had been given, the only way to prove that her foresight had been real and important. Regardless of her motivations, the result was absolute. Oenone refused to heal Paris. His servants carried him back toward Troy, hoping perhaps to find some other healer who might be able to help. But the journey was too much for Paris's failing body. Before they could reach the city, Paris died from the poison that Philoctetes's arrow had delivered into his veins. The prince who had started the Trojan War, who had chosen love over power and wisdom, who had abandoned one woman to possess another, breathed his last on the slopes of Mount Ida, not far from where he had once lived in simple happiness with Oenone and their son. When news of Paris's death reached Oenone, something broke inside her. The anger that had sustained her refusal crumbled in the face of the reality that Paris was truly gone. Whatever he had done, however deeply he had hurt her, she had loved him once. They had been happy together. They had made a child together. And now he was dead. And she was the one who could have prevented it. The guilt and grief overwhelmed her. In various ancient accounts, Oenone either hanged herself or threw herself onto Paris's funeral pyre, choosing to die with him, rather than continue living with the knowledge that her refusal had killed the man she had once loved. Their son, Corythus, would survive them both. His fate ultimately intertwined with the continued cycle of tragedy surrounding this family. With Paris dead, Helen's position in Troy became even more precarious. The Trojans, who had tolerated her presence largely because of Paris's insistence and Priam's acceptance, now had no reason to continue protecting her. But the war was too far advanced for her return to make any difference. Too much blood had been spilled, too many lives lost. The conflict had taken on a momentum of its own, becoming about pride and revenge rather than about Helen herself. According to tradition, Helen was quickly married to another of Priam's sons, Deiphobus, though this union appears to have been motivated more by political necessity than affection. Deiphobus would be one of the Trojan leaders during the final stages of the war, though his fate would ultimately be as tragic as that of most of Troy's defenders. The war itself continued for a time after Paris's death. though the Trojans were increasingly desperate. The Greeks had learned through prophecy what conditions needed to be met for Troy to fall, and they were methodically fulfilling each requirement. They had brought Philoctetes and his bow to Troy. They had stolen the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena that protected the city. And finally, they employed the stratagem that would give them victory: the famous Trojan horse. Odysseus conceived the plan that would end the war. The Greeks would construct an enormous wooden horse, large enough to conceal dozens of warriors inside its hollow belly. They would leave it outside Troy's gates as an apparent offering to the gods, while the rest of the Greek army sailed away, making it appear that they had finally given up the siege and gone home. The Trojans, believing themselves victorious, would bring the horse inside their walls as a trophy. That night, the Greek warriors hidden inside would emerge, open Troy's gates, and allow the rest of the Greek army, which had only sailed as far as a nearby island, to enter and sack the city. The plan worked better than anyone could have hoped. Despite the warnings of the prophetess Cassandra and the priest Laocoon, both of whom insisted that the horse was a trick and should be destroyed, the Trojans brought it into their city. That night, as Troy celebrated what they believed was the end of the war and the departure of the Greeks, the warriors hidden inside the horse emerged. They killed the guards at the gates and signaled to the Greek fleet, which had returned under cover of darkness. The Greek army poured into Troy, and the slaughter began. Helen's actions during the fall of Troy vary depending on which ancient source you consult. Some traditions claim that she had grown to genuinely love Troy and its people during her years there, and that she mourned its destruction even as she prepared to return to Sparta. Others suggest that she had been waiting for this moment, that she had secretly aided the Greeks during the infiltration, pointing out which houses held the greatest treasures and identifying where Trojan leaders were hiding. One particularly dark tradition even claims that she lured her husband Deiphobus into a trap where Menelaus could kill him. The reunion between Helen and Menelaus, after 10 years of war and countless deaths, was far from the simple romantic reconciliation that one might expect. According to several ancient sources, when Menelaus first encountered Helen among the ruins of Troy, he intended to kill her on the spot. He drew his sword, prepared to finally exact vengeance on the woman who had caused him such humiliation and the Greeks such tremendous loss. But then Helen, whether by accident or design, allowed her garment to fall open, revealing her famous beauty once again. Menelaus, confronted with the physical perfection that had caused all this suffering in the first place found himself unable to strike the killing blow. His sword fell from his hand, and instead of murder, there was reconciliation. The Greeks, witnessing this reunion, had mixed reactions. Some were furious that Menelaus would take back the woman who had betrayed him, the woman for whose sake so many of their comrades had died. Others understood that Helen's beauty was not a normal human quality, but something that touched on the divine, that judging her by normal moral standards was perhaps inappropriate. And some simply wanted to go home after 10 years of warfare. And if Menelaus was willing to reconcile with his wife, then the war was truly over, and they could finally leave this cursed land. The journey back to Sparta was not straightforward. Homer's Odyssey mentions briefly that Menelaus and Helen were blown off course and spent several years wandering the Mediterranean before finally making it home. During this extended voyage, they apparently reached some form of genuine reconciliation. By the time they appear in the Odyssey, visiting Telemachus, who has come seeking news of his father Odysseus, they appear to be a couple who has found a way to live together peacefully despite everything that has happened. In that scene from the Odyssey, Helen and Menelaus are shown hosting Telemachus in their palace in Sparta. They tell stories about the Trojan War, with Helen sharing tales that paint her in a more favorable light, suggesting that she had secretly been aiding the Greeks all along. She speaks of how she recognized Odysseus when he infiltrated Troy disguised as a beggar. But rather than revealing him, she helped him gather intelligence and then sent him safely on his way. She claims that she had long regretted her decision to come to Troy, that she had wanted to return to her homeland, but had been unable to do so. Menelaus, for his part, tells a complimentary story, describing how Helen had walked around the Trojan horse on the night it sat inside Troy's walls, calling out to the Greek warriors hidden inside in voices that mimicked their wives, trying to trick them into revealing themselves. This story suggests a more ambiguous Helen, someone still loyal to Troy at that crucial moment, trying to expose the Greek stratagem. But the story is told without rancor, almost as an amusing anecdote rather than an accusation. The implication is that Helen and Menelaus have found a way to live with the complicated past they share. Different ancient authors provided different endings for Helen and Menelaus after they returned to Sparta. In the most common tradition, they lived out their days together as king and queen of Sparta, their marriage somehow surviving despite everything it had endured. Some sources claim they grew old together in relative peace, finally finding the domestic harmony that had been so spectacularly disrupted by Paris's arrival years before. But other traditions offer more mythologically elaborate conclusions. Some sources claim that Helen never actually went to Troy at all, that the gods created a phantom duplicate of her, made of clouds or other insubstantial material, and that this simulacrum was what Paris took to Troy, while the real Helen spent the war years in Egypt. In this version, when Menelaus stopped in Egypt on his way home, he discovered his actual wife and was reunited with her, learning that the war had been fought over an illusion. This tradition attempts to preserve Helen's innocence, to absolve her of responsibility for the war by claiming she was never actually involved in the transgression that started it all. Euripides explored this version in his play Helen, presenting a tragic figure who suffered for years because of a crime she never actually committed. The most unusual tradition regarding Helen's ultimate fate claims that after death, she was granted immortality and taken to the Elysian fields, the paradise reserved for the greatest heroes and those beloved by the gods. In some versions, she was married there to Achilles, the hero who had died at Troy, creating a strange symmetry where the war's greatest warrior and its most beautiful woman were united in death, despite never having met in life. This tradition emphasizes Helen's divine heritage, suggesting that as a daughter of Zeus, she could not simply die as mortals do, but had to be given some form of eternal existence. As we consider the full arc of Paris and Helen's story, from the judgment of Paris through the Trojan War to their various fates, we're confronted with questions that have no easy answers. Was Helen a victim of divine manipulation, unable to resist Aphrodite's power? Or was she a willing participant in an affair that she knew would have catastrophic consequences? Did Paris genuinely love her? Or was he simply claiming the prize that a goddess had promised him? Could any love, no matter how intense, possibly justify the destruction that followed in its wake? The ancient authors themselves couldn't agree on these questions. Some portrayed Helen as a helpless pawn, others as a willing adulteress. Some painted Paris as a romantic hero following his heart, others as a selfish coward who brought ruin to his family and his city. The ambiguity is itself significant, reflecting the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of assigning simple moral judgments to complicated situations. What we can say is that the story of Paris and Helen has endured for more than 3,000 years precisely because it captures something essential about the human experience of love and desire. It asks us to consider what price we would pay for passion, what obligations we would break for the promise of something transcendent. It forces us to confront the reality that love, which we celebrate as one of humanity's highest experiences, can also be destructive, selfish, and catastrophic in its consequences. The story also explores the tension between individual desire and collective good. Paris and Helen's personal happiness, assuming they found any happiness together, came at the cost of 10 years of warfare, countless deaths, and the complete destruction of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Was their love worth that price? Most ancient authors would say no, that no personal relationship could justify such widespread suffering. But the very fact that the story has been told and retold for millennia suggests something else as well. That there's something compelling about people who choose love despite the consequences, who follow their hearts even when their heads tell them the price is too high. The role of the gods in this story complicates any attempt at simple moral judgment. If Aphrodite truly did cast a spell over Helen, if she made it impossible for Helen to resist Paris, then how can Helen be held responsible for her actions? And yet, the ancient sources suggest that Helen did have agency, that she made choices even if those choices were made under divine influence. The gods in Greek mythology don't typically override free will completely. Rather, they create circumstances where mortals are drawn toward particular choices. They amplify existing desires, create opportunities, remove obstacles. But at the end of the day, mortals still choose. This interplay between fate and free will, between divine influence and human responsibility, runs throughout Greek mythology and finds one of its most perfect expressions in the story of Paris and Helen. The judgment of Paris set events in motion, creating the conditions under which Paris would meet Helen, and Helen would be drawn to Paris. But Paris still chose to go to Sparta. Helen still chose to leave with him, or at the very least, chose not to fight too hard against being taken. Troy still chose to keep her rather than returning her to Menelaus. Each choice led to the next, creating a chain of cause and effect that ended in catastrophe. The story also serves as a meditation on beauty itself, on the power and danger of exceptional physical attractiveness. Helen's beauty is consistently portrayed as something beyond normal human loveliness, something that touches on the divine. It's not just that she was pretty. It's that her appearance had an almost magical effect on those who saw her. Overwhelming rational judgment and inspiring obsessive desire. The old men on Troy's walls couldn't help but acknowledge that her beauty made the war seem justified, even as they intellectually recognized what a terrible thing that was to think. This treatment of beauty as a supernatural force rather than simply a pleasant physical quality, reflects ancient Greek anxieties about the power of physical attraction. Beauty, in this framework, is dangerous precisely because it can override reason, can make people act against their own interests and the interests of their communities. Helen's face launched 1,000 ships, not because she wanted it to, but because that's what beauty of that magnitude inevitably does. It destabilizes, disrupts, destroys. Oenone's role in the story provides a fascinating counterpoint to Helen. Here was a woman who loved Paris genuinely, who built a life with him, who bore his child. She had her own beauty and her own supernatural gifts. But Paris left her anyway when the promise of Helen appeared. The contrast between the two women suggests that whatever Paris felt for Oenone, it couldn't compete with the overwhelming attraction of Helen's divinely enhanced beauty, combined with Aphrodite's manipulation. Oenone's tragic fate, refusing to heal Paris and then killing herself in remorse, adds another layer of suffering to a story already saturated with tragedy. The prophecies that bookend Paris's life deserve consideration as well. He was marked for doom from before his birth, destined to bring destruction to Troy. His parents tried to avoid this fate by exposing him on Mount Ida. But fate cannot be escaped in Greek mythology. He survived, grew to adulthood, made the choices that fulfilled the prophecy, and brought about exactly the destruction that had been foretold. This deterministic view of fate, where prophecies always come true regardless of efforts to prevent them, raises troubling questions about moral responsibility. If Paris was always destined to cause Troy's fall, can he really be blamed for it? Yet the ancient sources don't let him off the hook. They still judge his choices, still criticize his selfishness and cowardice, still hold him accountable for his actions, even while acknowledging that those actions were in some sense predetermined. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between fate and responsibility, one that recognizes that even if the broad outlines of our lives are determined by forces beyond our control, we still make meaningful choices within those constraints, and those choices still matter morally. The Trojan War itself, the great conflict that forms the backdrop to the later stages of Paris and Helen's story, has been interpreted in countless ways over the centuries. Some see it as a historical conflict between Bronze Age civilizations that was later mythologized. Others view it as purely mythological, a story meant to explore themes of heroism, honor, and the relationship between mortals and gods. But regardless of its historical reality, the war serves in mythology as the ultimate expression of how individual choices can have vast collective consequences, how a personal, romantic drama can escalate into civilizational conflict. The war lasted 10 years, meaning that an entire generation grew up knowing nothing but conflict. Children who were born when Paris first brought Helen to Troy were 10 years old when the city finally fell. Warriors who had been young men when they first sailed to Troy were approaching middle age by the time they finally returned home, those who returned at all. The conflict consumed resources, destroyed families, and fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. And at the center of it all was the relationship between two people whose love or lust or divine compulsion had started everything. Homer's treatment of Helen in the Iliad remains one of the most psychologically sophisticated portrayals of her in all of ancient literature. He presents her as deeply conflicted, fully aware of the destruction she has caused, filled with self-loathing, yet unable to undo what has been done. Her scene with Hector, Paris's brother, is particularly poignant. She wishes that she had died before causing such suffering, and she speaks kindly to Hector while criticizing Paris, recognizing Hector's nobility in contrast to her lover's weakness. This is not a woman who is happy with her choices, but neither is it a woman who can claim to have had no choice at all. The question of whether Helen and Paris were truly in love remains fundamentally unanswerable. Ancient sources suggest various levels of affection between them, from genuine passion to something more like resigned cohabitation. What seems clear is that whatever they felt for each other, it was complicated by guilt, regret, and the awareness of what their relationship had cost. It's hard to imagine that any romance could survive unstained under the weight of knowing that tens of thousands had died because you ran away together. Paris's death before Troy's fall meant that he never had to witness the complete destruction of his city, never had to see his father killed, his brothers slaughtered, his sisters taken as slaves, his home reduced to rubble and ashes. In that sense, perhaps the poisoned arrow that killed him was a mercy, sparing him the sight of the prophecy fulfilling itself completely. But he died knowing that he had failed, that his choice to keep Helen rather than return her had brought Troy to the brink of destruction, and that his death would do nothing to prevent the catastrophe he had set in motion. The image of Paris dying on Mount Ida, returning to the place where he had once lived simply and happily with Oenone, carries its own tragic poetry. He died, essentially, trying to return to a past that his own choices had made irretrievable. Oenone could have saved him, but chose not to. Chose instead to make him face the consequences of having abandoned her. Her subsequent suicide suggests that this choice brought her no satisfaction, that revenge proved so hollow as Paris's quest for the most beautiful woman in the world had proven hollow. In the end, the story of Paris and Helen is a tragedy in the truest sense. It depicts people making choices that seem rational, or at least understandable in the moment, but that lead to catastrophic consequences that could not have been fully anticipated. It shows how personal desires, divine manipulation, and inexorable fate can combine to create disasters that dwarf the intentions of any individual participant. It demonstrates how love, which should be the most positive of human emotions, can become the catalyst for unimaginable suffering when it conflicts with social obligations and moral duties. The story also explores what it means to live with the consequences of our choices. Helen, according to most traditions, survived the war and returned to Sparta. She had to live with the knowledge of what her decision to leave with Paris had caused. She had to face her daughter, whom she had abandoned. She had to rebuild a relationship with a husband she had betrayed. She had to exist in a world where everyone knew her as the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships, the woman who had caused the Trojan War. That's its own kind of tragedy, perhaps, surviving when so many others died, carrying the burden of that survival and that responsibility for the rest of a long life. Paris, at least, was spared that extended reckoning. He died relatively young, before he had to fully account for what he had done. But his death was painful and lonely. Rejected by the woman he had once loved, unable to be saved by the woman he had chosen over her, dying slowly from poison with the full knowledge that his decisions had brought his entire civilization to the brink of annihilation. There's a bitter justice in the fact that it was Oenon, the faithful wife he had abandoned, who had the power to save him, but chose not to exercise it. The enduring power of this story lies in its refusal to offer simple answers. It doesn't tell us that Paris and Helen were evil people who deserved punishment, nor does it portray them as innocent victims of divine manipulation who bear no responsibility for what happened. Instead, it presents them as deeply flawed people who made understandable but catastrophically wrong choices, who were both agents of their own fates and pawns in games played by beings far more powerful than themselves. 3,000 years after the events it describes, whether those events were historical or purely mythological, the story of Paris and Helen continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental human experiences. We all face choices between duty and desire, We all wonder how much we're truly in control of our own lives versus being pushed along by forces we don't fully understand. We all have to live with the consequences of our decisions, both the intended and the unintended ones. And we all know what it's like to want something so badly that we're willing to ignore the warning signs, to dismiss the cost, to tell ourselves that somehow it will all work out, despite all evidence to the contrary. The story reminds us that our choices matter, that they ripple outward in ways we often cannot predict, affecting not just ourselves, but everyone around us. It suggests that love, while beautiful and powerful, is not automatically good, that it can be destructive when it conflicts with other values and obligations. It demonstrates that beauty, while alluring, can be dangerous, that being drawn to something or someone doesn't mean that pursuing that attraction is wise or right. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Paris and Helen forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We want to believe that we would make the right choice when faced with temptation, that we would prioritize duty over desire, that we would think about the consequences of our actions before acting. But the story suggests that when confronted with something we want badly enough, when divine-level temptation is placed before us, we might make the same choices that Paris and Helen made. We might tell ourselves that somehow it will be different for us, that we can have what we want without paying the price that others have paid. And we would probably be wrong, just as they were wrong. The gods in this story, particularly Aphrodite, serve as representations of the forces within us that push us toward pleasure and passion without regard for consequences. When the ancient Greeks depicted the gods interfering in human affairs, they were often expressing truths about human psychology and motivation. Aphrodite, making Helen fall in love with Paris, is another way of saying that sexual attraction and romantic desire can override our better judgment, can make us do things we know are wrong, can lead us to betray people we love and obligations we hold sacred. Yet the story also contains moments of genuine pathos and beauty. The image of Helen on the walls of Troy, looking down at the armies arrayed against each other, full of regret for what she has caused, but unable to undo it. The old men acknowledging her beauty, even as they wish she had never come to their city. Paris and Helen living together in Troy. Their relationship surely strained by the reality of the war raging around them, by the knowledge of what their love has cost. Oenone, standing before the dying Paris, the man who had once been her world, choosing not to save him, and then being unable to live with that choice. These moments capture something true about human experience, about regret and consequence and the complexity of our emotional lives. The story's ending, with its multiple variations depending on which source you consult, reflects the difficulty ancient authors had in deciding what should happen to Helen. Should she be punished for her role in the war? Should she be forgiven because she was manipulated by a goddess? Should she and Menelaus be able to rebuild their relationship? Or is what they did to each other too great to overcome? Different authors answered these questions differently, suggesting that even in antiquity, there was no consensus about how to judge these characters or what their ultimate fate should be. What remains constant across all versions is the sense that something precious and irreplaceable was lost. Troy, one of the greatest cities of the Bronze Age, was destroyed completely. An entire generation of heroes died. Families were torn apart. The world that existed before Paris went to Sparta was fundamentally different from the world that existed after Troy fell. The story serves as a reminder that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. That some choices lead to consequences so severe that there's no going back to the way things were before. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the story of Paris and Helen remind you that we are all, in our own ways, making choices whose full consequences we cannot foresee. We are all navigating between competing desires and obligations. We are all trying to figure out what we want and whether the cost of getting it is worth paying. The stakes in our lives may not involve the destruction of cities or wars that last a decade, but the fundamental dilemma remains the same. How do we balance what we want with what we owe to others? How do we live with the choices we make and the consequences that follow from them? The ancient Greeks told this story not to provide easy answers, but to explore these difficult questions, to remind themselves that human beings are capable of both great nobility and terrible destructiveness, often simultaneously. They recognized that love could be both the most beautiful and the most dangerous force in human experience. They understood that choices made in passion could have consequences that lasted generations. And they knew that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to live with what we have done and to try to find a way forward despite everything that has been lost. So rest now and let these ancient voices whisper their timeless truths. Let the story of Paris and Helen, with all its passion and tragedy, its divine intervention and human weakness, its beauty and its horror, remind you of the precious complexity of the life we all share. Let it speak to you of love and war, of choice and consequence, of the price we pay for following our hearts, and the weight of the paths not taken. If you enjoyed this journey into one of mythology's most famous and controversial love stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Myths of the Night. Your support helps us continue bringing you these ancient tales, exploring the stories that have shaped human culture for thousands of years. Share this with someone who loves mythology, or with anyone who might benefit from these timeless reflections on love, choice, and consequence. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with stories that have endured through the ages.